much. And thank you for hanging in here after I know what has been a very long day. You have heard from many, many presidential candidates, and perhaps you haven't made up your mind who to support yet, or maybe you have. But one thing I know for sure, in your heart of hearts, you cannot wait to see me debate Hillary Clinton. And that's because you know what will happen. I will win. And it's actually really important to win. And the only way you're going to see that debate is if I am our party's nominee. You know, last night I hosted a live town hall on Periscope, on Twitter, on Facebook, on our website, carlyforpresident.com, and we answered questions live for an hour from tens of thousands of voters all across this country. But I must tell you that I considered canceling that event as news of the what seem now pretty clearly to be terrorist attacks trickled in from San Bernardino, California. In the end, though, I decided it was even more important to go ahead with that town hall meeting because these are perilous times, and leadership, the subject of leadership, which is indeed the subject of this election, is more important than ever. One of the things that's crystal clear is that we are missing leadership from the White House, and indeed Hillary Clinton has not exhibited leadership on any of these important issues. We are missing as well a sense of urgency. Hillary Clinton was tweeting about gun control while we learned that radicalized Islamic terrorists have been building pipe bombs. It's clear one of our priorities must be, as I said in my blueprint to take back our country last night, one of our priorities must be to defeat ISIS, not to contain them, not to degrade them, to defeat ISIS and to be back in the leadership business. And no, Mr. President, they're not contained. They're at our shores. They're in our community centers. And their measure of victory is the body count. I'm angry. Maybe you're angry as well. I'm angry. I am angry because this president and the soon-to-be Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, do not understand this threat and refuse to call it by its name, radical Islamic terrorism. While they turn their back on Israel to negotiate an absolutely catastrophic deal with Iran, they send a signal all throughout the world that the friendship with the United States of America doesn't mean very much. I am angry at the moral equivalence that they use to talk about the Palestinian and the Israeli role in the peace process. There is no moral equivalence between Israel and the Palestinians. You cannot make peace with people who will not acknowledge your existence. I am angry that Hillary Clinton dares to ask what difference does it make when she asks how 4 Americans died in Benghazi. And then she tells us that we must empathize with our enemy. Mrs. Clinton, when the United States does not answer a purposeful terrorist attack on a United States embassy with a purposeful and focused response, but instead talks about a video that does not respect our values, you are inviting more terrorism and bloodshed around the world. I'm angry that President Obama and Hillary Clinton declared victory in Iraq in 2011, sacrificing all our hard-fought gains for purely political expediency, contrary to the advice of every military expert, leaving vast swaths of territory and too much weaponry to be gobbled up by ISIS. And ISIS gains their legitimacy, their power from their territory, which they call their caliphate. We must deny them territory. I'm angry that President Obama says that we unilaterally must accept thousands of Syrian refugees, even as his own administration acknowledges that we cannot possibly vet them adequately to determine their ties to terrorism. And mostly, I am outraged because the murder, the mayhem, the danger that we see unfolding in Paris, Beirut, San Bernardino are the direct consequence of this administration's policies. You cannot lead from behind. The world is a very dangerous and a very tragic place when the United States of America does not lead. We cannot be the world's policeman, but we must be the world's leader. And so it is worth contemplating why only this nation can lead. It is because our nation was founded on a unique premise, that each individual life has value, that we judge an individual as an individual by the content of their character, as Martin Luther King would say, not by the group to which they belong. Our nation was founded on the idea that each of us has the right to fulfill our potential, to find and use our God-given gifts. Our founders used the term life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what they meant was the right to fulfill our potential. And our founders said that this right comes from God and cannot be taken away by man or government. Ladies and gentlemen, I am running for the presidency of the United States because I think we have settled for too long for a government that has grown so big, so powerful, so costly, so complicated, so inept, and so corrupt, and by a professional political class that talks a good game election after election after election, but actually doesn't really change anything. I believe we have come to a pivotal point. I believe we have come to a pivotal point where it is time, citizens, to take our country back and remember that ours was intended to be a citizen government. Our Constitution was written as much to curb the abuse of power as it was to protect individual rights. We are not a perfect nation, and we have had to work hard to make sure that rights apply to everyone. But we are nevertheless, despite our imperfections, an exceptional nation. And it is nevertheless true that in this exceptional nation, more things have been more possible for more people from more places than anywhere else on the face of the earth. And we are an exceptional nation, because this is the only nation that possesses military superiority and yet has never used that military superiority to conquer territory or to subjugate people, but instead has used our power to liberate people and to lift people up. This, Mr. President, is why we are an exceptional nation, and when you are exceptional, you must lead, and so we must. Aristotle once said that courage is the most important virtue, because without courage, none of the other virtues can be practiced. And so we must have the courage to lead. I must say that when I have traveled to Israel, there are two things that have struck me always about that beautiful country and its people: courage and optimism. And that is an incredibly important combination. The combination of courage and optimism. Yes, the Israelis are always and also entrepreneurial and innovative, but that combination of courage and optimism is what is required to change the world and to lead. We must have the strongest economy and the strongest military on the face of the planet, and everyone has to know it. As president, I am determined to take our government back, to hold it accountable, to restore possibilities to every American, regardless of their circumstances. And I have the courage and the experience to lead once again in the world. As Commander-in-Chief, I will not only invest in our military, I will honor our military, and I will listen to our military and to their advice. And in order to have the strongest military on the face of the planet, not only do we have to rebuild so much of our military capability, but we also must care for those who have served. Finally, after years of talk from both parties, after decades, we must reform the VA from top to bottom. It is a stain on our nation's honor when we cannot care for those who have served. But this is not the leadership we have now, and this is not the leadership we will have from Mrs. Clinton, because as the Paris terrorist attacks are fresh still in our minds. President Obama, there is a Freudian slip. President Obama and, she hopes, President Clinton say that climate change is our most pressing national security crisis. No, Mrs. Clinton, climate change is not our most pressing national security crisis. ISIS is, followed closely by Iran. I can remember traveling to Israel several years ago and sitting with Bibi Netanyahu in his office. I remember him talking, as he does, in very eloquent and very specific terms about the danger of radical Islamic extremism and about the danger of Iran as well. And then I remember, because I have held the highest clearances available to a civilian, I remember walking down the hall and speaking with the head of Mossad about both of these two risks as well. ISIS is at war with us and all we represent, and so we must wage this war and we must win. This does not mean that we repeat all of the nation building and the naivete, the mistakes of Afghanistan and Iraq, but it does mean, as I've said, that we must deny ISIS territory. We cannot permit them to rape, to subjugate, to terrorize, to crucify, to behead, and to sell into slavery their enemies. And we cannot permit them to use their territories to train and prepare for jihad around the world. And so we must gather our allies and lead. France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, all are threatened, as is every nation in Europe. Jordan, Kuwait, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Kurds, all are fighting ISIS to some extent on the ground as we speak, and all have asked for support, weapons, materiel, and intelligence sharing from us. Mostly this administration has said no. I will say yes. Russia and Iran, of course, represent real national security threats over the medium term, China over the long term, and we have to confront both our near-term, our medium-term, and our long-term adversaries. And we must stand with our allies now, because when we fail to stand with our allies, they lose courage and our adversaries move forward. And so on day one of my administration, I will make two phone calls. The first will be to my good friend Bibi Netanyahu, to reassure him that we will stand with the state of Israel always. And lest you think I say this only because I am here at the RJC, I have been saying this publicly month after month after month. Because you see, I know that even our allies who do not always agree with Israel watch how we are treating this exceptional nation and our exceptional ally Israel, watch how we treat Israel, and conclude that if we are treating Israel in the way we have been for the last several years, then their friendship does not mean much either. The second phone call that I will make will be to the supreme leader of Iran. Unlike many of the other leaders in the Middle East, I have never met him, and frankly, he probably will not take my phone call, but he will get my message. The message will be very clear. New deal. New deal with a new president. Until and unless you open every military and every nuclear facility to real anytime, anywhere inspections by our people, not yours, we, the United States of America, will make it as difficult as possible for you to move money. We must stop the money flow. And the United States of America can do that without permission or collaboration. We must stop the money flow because the money, the hundreds of billions of dollars of money that is flowing into Iran now as a result of this terrible deal, is being used to fuel and fund military capability, nuclear capability, and terrorist groups around the Middle East and around the world. With these two phone calls, as important as each one of these two phone calls is, they also send a loud and clear signal to every ally we have in this world and every adversary as well. The United States of America is back in the leadership business. Israel, indeed, is the canary in the coal mine. They are also a nation of extraordinary courage and optimism, entrepreneurialism, innovation, an island of democracy and diversity in a very rough neighborhood. I understand the world and who is in it, and that matters, because having been in the world and in it for decades is very different than reading something in a briefing book. I have operated around the world for decades, in business, in charity, in policy. I have held the highest security clearances available to a civilian. I have chaired the advisory board at the CIA, advised the NSA, 2 secretaries of defense, a secretary of state, and a secretary of homeland security. I have met more world leaders than anyone running today, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton, only I didn't do photo ops. I did meetings on business and policy and charity. And it makes a difference having been in these regions of the world. I'll pause and tell you a very brief story, but I remember being in an automobile in Jordan, one of the more moderate countries in the Middle East, as you well know. And for some reason, I asked the driver if I could see a map. He handed me a map, and in the space on the map where Israel should be was nothing but white. And I asked him, "What is this white space?" And he said, "Oh, that doesn't exist." You see, when people like the supreme leader of Iran say their mission is to wipe Israel off the face of the map, I know it is not political rhetoric, it is powerful ideology, because I have been there and I have seen it. We need a president who will see and speak and act on the truth. She must understand how truly exceptional our nation is. She must have the courage to call evil by its name. I will have the courage to lead. We must nominate and elect a president who proudly will wear the mantle of leadership that a weary world is eager for us to wear. I know what such leadership requires. I have been tested. I will recognize dangers with eyes wide open, but I will also embrace with arms open wide the marvelous opportunities of this century. With your prayers, with your support, with your votes, I will lead the resurgence of this great nation, here at home and around the world. Ours was intended to be a citizen government. Our nation is exceptional and is intended to lead. My fellow citizens, it is time to take our country back. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir, I'd love to.
Excellent. As a business executive, you've obviously negotiated many deals.
Yes, I have negotiated many deals. Maybe even more than Mr. Trump, who knows?
So in light of that, do you believe it's possible to negotiate a peace between Israel and the Palestinians? And what role would you see your administration having in that effort?
Well, frankly, I think that answer depends very much on the Palestinians. You cannot negotiate a deal with people who do not recognize your right to exist. So unless and until the leaders of the Palestinian people grow so war-weary that they are prepared to accept Israel's right to exist, then no, sadly, I do not believe peace is possible. However, I also believe that if a leader in the Oval Office makes that condition clear, over and over and over, instead of the moral equivalence that we have seen too often from this administration, but frankly, sometimes from the previous Clinton administration as well. I think if that demand is clear and unequivocal, then perhaps we can bring the Palestinians to the table with that condition in mind.
Putting on your technology hat for a second, how would you deter and prevent cyber attacks and industrial espionage from countries such as China, Russia, and Iran? And do you consider these efforts, these attacks, acts of war?
So the short answer is yes. In many cases, they are acts of war. In some cases, they are what I would call commercial espionage, but nevertheless, they are a problem. And sadly, we are losing the war in cyberspace, not because we lack the capability, but frankly, because of government ineptitude. That's a pretty strong word. But let me give you an example of what we mean. As someone who's held the highest clearances available to a civilian, I know, as many do, that we have known about the threat from the Chinese to hack into our most sensitive government databases and systems for over a decade. In fact, the Office of Personnel Management was warned very explicitly and very specifically about security holes in their systems and databases, and yet they did nothing about them. We can lead in cyberspace, but we are not today. So I would do several things very specifically. Number one, I would stand up a centralized cyber command in the federal government and hold it accountable. Number two, I would pass a law that is required to pass to permit the kind of collaboration and coordination between the private sector and the public sector, which is not going on today, which is vital in order to be able to detect and repel all of these cyber attacks. Number three, we are having a debate in the Republican Party right now about whether we should go back to the Patriot Act or stick with what we now currently have. It is the wrong debate. It is coming, frankly, from politicians who do not understand technology. Technology has moved on light years since the Patriot Act was passed. Light years. There are technologies available today that the Patriot Act did not even envision. We have encryption technologies today that serve the American people very well, for example, in protecting their own commercial transactions. And so now what we need to do is bring together the best minds in the private sector and the best minds in the public sector and say, how is it that we now, with these new and marvelous technologies that American companies are inventing, how do we make sure that we protect our own citizens' privacies and still give our law enforcement, our intelligence, and our military personnel the tools that they need to fight terrorism? And finally, the fourth thing that I would do, in addition to those three I just mentioned, is retaliate. Because when the Chinese hack into our systems and databases, we must fight back.
How vulnerable, by the way, is our main infrastructure, some of our main infrastructure to cyber attack?
Very, very. And we have the capability to solve this problem. But most of that capability exists in the private sector. And it is why we must bring the private sector into a real collaboration with the public sector. By the way, you might be asking yourselves, why isn't that bill that is required to allow some collaboration, coordination between private networks and public networks, why hasn't that bill been passed? I'll tell you why. Because politicians lost the courage to have the conversation with the American people about why it was necessary in the wake of Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden has scared everybody. Yes, Edward Snowden is without a doubt a traitor and should be tried for treason. But it is also clear that so many of our politicians either don't have the courage or the understanding to talk with the American people about how we ought to be winning this fight. We are the most sophisticated technological nation on the planet. We're losing because of ineptitude and a lack of leadership. It is yet another reason why we must take our government back.
Right. Last question, and I'll tee one up for you to hit out of the park. The Democrats repeatedly try to make the claim that the GOP has a war on women. How do you respond to them?
Well, you'll have to wait for that debate between me and Hillary Clinton to hear that. But you see, actually, this is why we need a fearless fighter to face Hillary Clinton, who will force her to fight on ground that we can win on. Look, Hillary Clinton does not want to run on her track record as Secretary of State. Why? Because she got every single foreign policy challenge wrong. Every single one. I've met Vladimir Putin. Anyone who's spent any time with Putin knows you do not change his behavior with a gimmicky red reset button. No, you might change his behavior by rebuilding the Sixth Fleet under his nose, or rebuilding the missile defense program under his nose, or conducting regular military exercises. She called Bashar al-Assad a positive reformer. She declared victory in Iraq. She advocated for the removal of Muammar Gaddafi and then left Libya as a failed state where we now know ISIS has new territory. So she cannot run on her track record as Secretary of State. But what does she want to run on? What is the platform that Hillary Clinton wants to run on? she is going to be the first woman president. Ladies and gentlemen, I will never ask for your support because I am a woman, although I am proud to be one. But I will tell you what, I will force Hillary Clinton to fight on ground where she will have to talk about the reality that every single one of her policies are bad for women as well as men. She will have to fight on the ground of her track record as Secretary of State. And ladies and gentlemen, if she faces me, we will win.
And I think that is a perfect conclusion to our day.
Happy Hanukkah, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me, and happy 30th anniversary. Thank you so much. Happy Hanukkah.